First story, Whispers of Hollow Lake. I remember the first time I saw the house by Hollow Lake. It was on a crisp October afternoon when the fog hung low over the water, curling around the dead trees like ghosts. The locals in Westbridge always warned me to stay away, but curiosity had its own way of dragging me back every time. The house was old, a sprawling Victorian relic with peeling white paint and windows like black, watching eyes. No one had lived there for decades, or so they said. I was new in town, having moved from Chicago to escape a past I didn't want to carry. I thought the quiet of Westbridge would heal me. Instead, it started twisting me, piece by piece. The first night I stayed near the lake, I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the reeds, but the whispers grew clearer, like a voice just out of reach. "Come back," it said. "Don't leave." I wanted to laugh it off, but my heart pounded. I kept seeing shadows moving along the shore, always just beyond sight. My dreams became haunted by a woman in a soaked white dress, standing at the water's edge, her face blurred, her eyes deep pools of sorrow. The townsfolk avoided the place. Old Man Jenkins said the house was cursed, that a family had vanished one bitter winter, leaving everything behind like they never existed. No bodies, no explanation, just gone. One evening, I found a narrow path through the thicket and decided to get closer. The house loomed bigger, its broken windows like hollow sockets. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my boots. The air smelled damp and stale, as if trapped between the walls for a century. In the living room, I discovered a faded photograph, half buried under a pile of dust and broken glass. It showed a family of 4, their smiles frozen in time. The mother's eyes seemed to follow me, dark and pleading. I felt a cold grip on my chest. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. Panic surged through me, and I ran, but the house twisted. Hallways stretched endlessly, rooms rearranged like a nightmare maze. I was trapped. Hours, maybe days passed. I couldn't tell. The woman in white appeared, reaching out, mouthing words I couldn't hear. Her tears were blood, staining the floorboards. She pointed to a door I had missed before, its surface carved with strange symbols. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, a child's nursery frozen in time. Toys scattered, a cradle empty but rocking slowly, as if someone had just left. On the wall, scratched into the plaster, was a warning: leave or suffer. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The house demanded my presence. I saw flickering shadows of the family, trapped in endless torment, reliving the night they disappeared. A terrible force had claimed them, a darkness born from the lake itself. I begged for mercy, but the house whispered back, "Stay forever." Days later, my friends reported me missing. They found my car by the lake, doors unlocked, engine still warm, but I was gone. Sometimes late at night, I still hear their whispers through the fog, the woman's sorrow, the child's cries, the desperate plea to leave the house by Hollow Lake before it claims you too. Because some places don't want to be forgotten. Some places hunger. And that house, its heart beats beneath the water, waiting for the next soul to wander too close and never return. Second story, Whispers Beneath Silver Lake. I never believed the stories about Silver Lake until the night I moved into the old house by its shore. It was an unassuming place, weathered with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, yet it called to me in ways I couldn't explain. My name is Jack Morgan. I grew up in Cedar Falls, a small town about 20 miles from Silver Lake, but I never once ventured near the lake. It was always off limits, whispered about with fear and dread. Now, desperate for a fresh start, I bought that house, ignoring the locals' warnings. The first few days were peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. Every evening, I'd watch the sunset over the water, but at night, the house seemed to breathe with a life of its own. At first, I chalked it up to old pipes or the wind. But on the third night, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the floorboards. When I lifted the loose plank in the living room, there was nothing but dirt and darkness below. Curiosity overcame caution. I grabbed a flashlight and lowered myself into the crawl space. The smell was damp and earthy, but what caught my attention was an old wooden box buried halfway in the soil. Inside were yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. They told the story of a family who had lived there more than 100 years ago, the Thompsons. According to the letters, the father had been obsessed with the lake, convinced something lived beneath its surface, something ancient and hungry. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more urgent. I lay awake, heart pounding. The next morning, I explored the lake shore. The water was cold and still, reflecting a perfect sky. But as I walked the perimeter, I noticed strange markings carved into the bark of trees, symbols I couldn't recognize. Later, I showed them to an old historian in Cedar Falls, who looked at them with pale eyes. He said they were warnings, ancient sigils meant to keep something locked away. Days passed, and the atmosphere in the house thickened. I began hearing whispers, faint voices calling my name from the water. Sometimes a shadow flickered just beyond my vision. One evening, while writing at my desk, the room plunged into freezing cold. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a chilling breath on my neck. I spun around, nothing but the empty room. I tried to leave, but the lake had other plans. My car wouldn't start. The town's power flickered and died. I was trapped. On the seventh night, the full moon cast an eerie silver light over the lake. I stood on the porch, watching as the water rippled without wind. Suddenly, a figure rose from the depths, pale, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. It spoke in a voice like broken glass, warning me to leave or become part of the lake forever. I ran inside, but the doors slammed shut behind me. The tapping turned into pounding. Something beneath the house was breaking through. The floorboards cracked, and cold water seeped in. I realized the lake wasn't just water. It was a prison, holding something desperate to escape. In a final, desperate act, I smashed the window and dove into the lake, swimming frantically away from the house. But as I reached the shore, hands grabbed my ankles, pulling me. Third story, The Whispers of Lakewood Hollow. I never believed in the stories. Not the ones about that old house by Lakewood Hollow, the kind of place people pass by on the highway and speed up, nervously glancing at its crumbling walls and dark windows. They say the house has been abandoned for decades, that no one who's ever dared to stay overnight has ever come out the same. But I was never scared of old legends. I was a skeptic, and that was my first mistake. It all started when I inherited the house from my Uncle James. He was a quiet man, never spoke much about the place except to warn me to stay away. But curiosity got the better of me. I figured it was just a rundown cabin, perfect for a quiet weekend getaway from my busy life in Portland. I arrived on a chilly October afternoon, the wind sharp against my face as I drove down the narrow road leading to the lake. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the dense trees lining the path. The house was worse than I imagined. Paint peeled like old scars, windows boarded up, the roof sagging as if weighed down by decades of neglect. But what caught my attention was the silence, an eerie silence that swallowed every sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint lapping of the lake water against the shore. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and something else, a faint metallic scent like old blood. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots. I found an old journal on a rickety table in the corner of the living room, pages yellowed and brittle. It belonged to my Uncle James. His handwriting was frantic, full of strange symbols and warnings. "Do not trust the whispers," one entry read. "They come at night, carried by the wind from the lake. They promise safety, comfort, but they are lies. They want to pull you in." I laughed nervously and shoved the journal in my bag. That night, I set up a small fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth would keep the shadows at bay. Outside, the moon was a thin sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the twisted branches of the trees. Around midnight, I first heard it. A soft whisper, like the rustle of silk against skin, barely audible but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the whispers grew louder, forming words. My name, calling me closer to the lake. I fought the urge to listen, my heart hammered in my chest. I told myself it was just the mind playing tricks, but the whispers were relentless, wrapping around me like a cold fog. I tried to turn on the flashlight, but the beam flickered and died. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. My breath came out in white puffs. Then, through the window, I saw it. A pale figure standing at the water's edge, face obscured by shadows. It raised a hand, beckoning me. I froze. Panic surged through my veins. I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door, the whispers chasing me like a storm. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The next morning, I wanted to leave, but curiosity chained me. What was that figure? Who or what was calling me from the lake? Days passed. Every night, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. I could no longer tell if they were outside or inside my head. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind. One night, I followed the voice. It led me through the forest to an old dock crumbling into the water. The whispers became a chorus, singing a haunting lullaby. The pale figure waited at the end, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You belong here," it said, voice both beautiful and terrifying. I tried to turn away, but my feet moved forward on their own. The lake water was icy, pulling me in. I struggled, but the water was like quicksand, dragging me deeper. The whispers drowned out my screams. Then darkness. I woke up on the shore, alone, soaked and trembling. The house was gone, replaced by empty trees and overgrown brush. No sign it had ever been there. But the whispers never left. They are inside my mind now, calling me back to Lakewood Hollow. And I know I will never truly escape, because some houses don't just hold memories, they hold souls. And I am one of them now. Fourth story, Whispers from the Forsaken Lakehouse. I never believed in ghosts. Never. But that summer in Pine Hollow changed everything I thought I knew. The moment I stepped into that abandoned lake house, something inside me twisted, like the air itself was watching, waiting. The house sat at the edge of Lake Merrow, a place locals avoided, especially after sunset. Stories whispered about it, but I was a skeptic. I'm Jake Turner, born and raised in nearby Ashwood, and I figured it was just old-town folklore. When I inherited that place from an uncle I barely knew, curiosity took hold. On my first night I heard it, faint tapping against the window. I shrugged it off as branches, but the tapping kept coming, rhythmic, like a Morse code. Then the whispering started, low, barely audible, curling through the cracked walls. I told myself it was the wind until the shadows moved. The lake was dark and still, yet I could feel eyes watching me from beneath the surface. One evening, I saw a figure standing across the water, just beyond the tree line. When I blinked, it vanished. The locals wouldn't talk, their faces pale when I mentioned the house. Days passed, and I started finding things I hadn't brought, old photographs, faded and damp, of children staring with empty eyes. Names scratched into the wooden floor. Emily, Thomas, Sarah. I asked the town librarian, Mrs. Larkin, about them. She hesitated, then told me a chilling tale. Decades ago, a family lived there, the Howards. One night, the entire family disappeared without a trace. The town searched, but nothing was found except the lake. They say the lake took them. Some nights, you can hear their voices calling, begging for help. That night, I heard footsteps upstairs. No one should have been there. I crept up to the attic door. It was ajar. Inside, the air was icy cold, and a faint glow pulsed from the far corner. I saw a mirror, cracked and old, reflecting faces not my own. Then I saw her, Emily Howard, translucent and pale, reaching out. "Help us," she whispered. Panic flooded me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut. Trapped, I realized the house wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, a prison. The lake house fed on fear, on souls. I smashed the mirror, thinking it would break the curse. Instead, the whispers turned into screams. Water seeped from the walls, flooding the attic. I barely escaped, gasping on the porch. The next morning, the house was gone, just a barren patch by the lake, as if it never existed. But my reflection in the pond, it wasn't mine. It was Emily's. And now I'm trapped here, whispering my story to you, hoping someone hears before the lake claims them too. Fifth story, Whispers Beneath the Lakehouse. I never believed in the stories about the old lake house near Willow Creek until the night I found myself trapped inside it. My name is Jack Miller, and I grew up in a small town called Cedar Falls, nestled deep in the forests of Washington State. Everyone in town knew the house by the lake was cursed. Kids dared each other to get close, but none ever stayed longer than a few minutes. I always laughed it off. Ghost stories to scare kids, I thought. But that summer changed everything. It was a warm July evening when I decided to go exploring. My friends had dared me to spend a night inside that abandoned place. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as I stepped through the rusty gate. The house loomed large, peeling paint, broken windows, and the unmistakable smell of rot and decay. The silence around was suffocating, except for the occasional croak of frogs from the lake's edge. I pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and cobwebs brushed against my face. I took out my flashlight and scanned the room. Old furniture lay scattered, draped in white sheets. I could feel a chill crawl down my spine. It wasn't just the cold. There was something wrong. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper. My heart jumped. I told myself it was the wind. I took a deep breath and moved toward the staircase leading to the basement. Everyone said that the basement was the source of the strange happenings. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped sharply. My flashlight flickered. Then the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone calling my name. "Jack?" the voice breathed. I froze. No one knew I was here. No one called me by my first name like that. I wanted to run, but curiosity held me back. I followed the voice into the basement, a dark, damp room with stone walls covered in strange symbols painted in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was a circle carved into the floor. I stepped closer, and the whispers turned into agonized screams. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. I fell into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, drenched in sweat, the sun already high in the sky. But something was wrong. The lake house was gone. In its place was only a twisted stump of a tree and mud. I ran back to Cedar Falls, but people looked at me like I was a ghost. My phone didn't work, and no one remembered the lake house existing. I tried to tell my friends, but they called me crazy. Days passed. Strange things started happening. At night, I'd hear that whisper again, now inside my own home. Shadows moved in the corners of my eyes. My reflection in the mirror sometimes smiled back with a cruel grin. One night, the whispers turned to laughter, cold and hollow. Then a voice, deep and terrible, spoke from the darkness. "You opened the door. Now you belong to the lake." I understood then. The lake house wasn't just abandoned. It was a prison, a gateway. And by stepping inside, I had become its prisoner. I tried to leave Cedar Falls, but every road led me back home. The lake's cold grip was pulling me in, and the whispers promised only one end. I am trapped between worlds now, neither alive nor dead. The lake house is gone from the world, but it lives inside me. I am its echo. If you ever hear whispers calling your name near an abandoned house by the lake, don't listen. Don't follow. Because once you cross that threshold, there is no way back.